Welcome back to Media Apocalypse, our series about the threats facing journalism, news gathering, and the flow of information in our democracy, and dedicated to exploring the solutions, both legal and otherwise, for preserving the press functions. Our guest today is Siva Vaidhyanathan. He is the Robertson Professor of Media Studies and Director of the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. He's a prolific writer and commentator, including authorship of some books that are of particular interest to our viewers, two recent books about the threat to democracy posed by our new information landscape: Anti-Social Media, How Facebook Disconnects Us and Undermines Democracy, and The Googleization of Everything and Why We Should Worry. We're thrilled to have the chance to chat with you today, so thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, RonNell. It's really great to be part of this conversation. So I look forward to it.
Super. I'll kick things off with a couple of questions and then hand things off to my colleagues. Siva, a major theme that we have here on this program are sort of the shifts in and diminishment of what we think of as the press function, including things like checking the behavior of elected officials, gathering and distributing information on public issues, structuring our community conversations on matters of public concern. You were a really early voice, both of the ways that electoral politics seemed to be getting more Facebook dependent and of the ramifications that might have for democracy and the shape of our public conversations. Can you describe for us just broadly some of those ramifications and maybe tie in for us some of the connections that you see between this trend and the trend that we've been talking about here, the diminishment of the press function?
Yeah, sure. So think about the standard 20th century success stories of journalism, institutions that are running on the surplus created by this faith-based advertising system, right? A faith-based advertising system meaning one that can't be quantified very well, right? Don Draper sitting in his office, coming up with a storyboard, spinning yarns, selling fantasies, selling the dream, and the people who are trying to move products buy that because they have no reason to think it doesn't work, and everything seems to work because, after all, this is post-war United States and there's too much money chasing too few goods, and before you know it, people are getting rich and they believe that advertising makes a difference. And there are a whole bunch of really important parts of our democracy as well as our economy that run on that surplus, on that faith-based surplus. And so the what you might think of as the good years of the press function, 1945 to, let's say, 2000, although maybe you want to stretch it to 2010, you have all these institutions that are under different pressure. I mean, those all were not great years. When I was a professional journalist in the late 80s and early 90s, those were terrible years, and it wasn't my fault. But in those cases, you still had institutions able to make enough money to justify things that we started taking for granted, really expensive reporting projects, and a lot of frivolity that supported that. So we would encounter these packages that would sell us what we wanted. It might have been the bridge column. It might have been Family Circus and Dondi. It might have been the box scores. But along with it, we got some reports from the Moscow Bureau, the Tel Aviv Bureau, the Johannesburg Bureau. And these were often of papers that today we would not ever think had such a bureau. The Baltimore Sun had a Moscow bureau for many decades, right? The notion that a local paper in a market that small would have a Moscow bureau is kind of far-fetched right now. But it all ran on this surplus, right? Because people wanted the bridge column and people wanted to buy Chevrolets from the local Chevrolet dealer, and the Chevrolet dealer would put those ads. And this system seemed to work so well for so long that we started to naturalize it. We started to assume that this surplus would create a professionalization a set of standards, ethical standards, behavioral standards, investigative techniques. We created entire branches of universities devoted to it, running off that surplus. It was a weird century, the 20th. Well, things aren't that way anymore. Google and then Facebook figured out better ways to sell ads that didn't rely on magic. They actually relied on numbers, and you could show to an advertiser that this particular ad generated this much interest. In fact, perhaps generated, Y amount of revenue. And that was a new thing. And that sort of made the rest of our advertising habits not so attractive. So two things flowed out of that success. And let me move my attention just to Facebook for a moment, although a lot of what I have to say applies to Google. Once you have this movement of advertising dollars, which, still remains an important part of our economy, of the world economy, moving to this very efficient system and seemingly effective system of Facebook. And you have advertisements that are behaviorally targeted and very carefully targeted. You have a very different set of incentives for these businesses, and the businesses that used to rely on the old form of advertising, the faith-based Don Draper style of advertising, well, they have to cope. And for, more than a decade, let's say 13 years or so when it comes to Facebook, these businesses have been scrambling to compete for our attention. Once they figured out that Facebook and Google are in the attention business and have a masterful way of monetizing attention, they decided that they had to try to compete on that level, and it just wasn't a fair fight, and it remains not a fair fight. And so what we've seen is this weird churn of new ventures. I mean, the two that come to mind most easily are Huffington Post and BuzzFeed, new ventures that are really based on this economy. Huffington Post was built on the principle of search engine optimization. BuzzFeed was built on the principle of shareability, of engagement through social media analytics and virality. So, those are the two paradigmatic parts of this economy that rose. I mean, you could throw in a couple of more, but neither of those are particularly successful right now. And even they, designed for the current environment, couldn't stop the hemorrhaging of advertising money to the big motherships of Facebook and Google. So what happens is Facebook and Google, again, let me stick with Facebook, change not only the basic arithmetic of running these companies and puts them in a panicked mode to compete for attention, but they also, actually, pardon me, I have to turn something off here. I have to mute something. I had another machine running without mute on. So, but the other thing they did was create an editorial style change among many content producers. So whether you're running a television network or you're running what used to be called a newspaper or you're running a website like BuzzFeed, you are trying your best to tailor the images, the headlines, the first 20 words of every article to capture the attention of Facebook users and leverage the engagement that is likely to happen on Facebook, because you realize very early on that if you do not circulate on Facebook, you do not matter very much. Putting revenue aside, you're just not going to get the kind of audience engagement, audience attention that you desire for 100 different reasons if you can't master the Facebook algorithm. And this puts a lot of very serious publications and news outlets at a big disadvantage. The more serious you are, the more reserved you are, the more sober your tone, the deeper your research, the more you might be good for democracy, good for science, good for thinking, the worse you're going to do on Facebook. Facebook is designed to amplify things that spark strong emotions. So this is obvious to publishers, and they start, again, adapting, trying to tweak their headlines, trying to tweak their images, trying to tweak their content, making overall editorial decisions in ways that will pander to the Facebook algorithms. And this cycle is just not healthy, because this is all happening to do better on Facebook, so that using Facebook becomes more valuable in daily life to users. Using Facebook puts more news in front of users all the time. And what's happening there is basically these publications, these outlets are feeding the beast that is starving them. Because they're not getting ahead in the advertising revenue at the same time they're doing this. So, it's a downward spiral, and it's a downward spiral where everything is basically dictated by the needs or desires of Facebook's algorithms. And, that's not healthy, because, as it turns out that we have some big problems, and we could use some ways to think collectively about our problems. And the institutions upon which we used to depend to do this are atrophying, to put it mildly.
Yeah, can I want to, as a follow-up, sort of burrow down a little bit on that content question that you're describing, because you sort of described the ways that they've shifted our business model and ad flow, and then a bit the way that they have shifted the way that we share and collectively consume content. Let me ask a follow-up on the content question, if I can, and it sort of has two parts. I've heard you suggest in a number of settings that social media might be individually really beneficial, but collectively or societally really harmful. And I wonder if you can just sort of play out for us a little the specific ways in which you think that dichotomy is true. And also then maybe just sort of compare and contrast this with the engagement that citizens once had with the press. Was it collectively and individually beneficial, or did it have some of those same tensions? What kinds of trade-offs are we making as we transition to this new media landscape?
Well, so let me take that a little bit in reverse. So the 20th century mode of interaction with our news-bearing institutions was never great, and our news-bearing institutions were not great. If they, in many ways they're better now, and just in terms of their responsiveness to the diversity of the country, their responsiveness to the range of issues in the world, the level of education and mastery of the people who work in that industry is actually really impressive. And I say that as someone who was part of that guild in the late 20th century. I continue to be impressed by the 25, 30, 35-year-olds who are getting the opportunity to do outstanding work right now. That said, the rest of us who were consuming that might have just been reading Dondi and Family Circus and putting the rest aside. There's no way to know whether we were reading that Baltimore Sun byline from Moscow in 1989. It's really a leap to try to assume that because content existed in a paper that had large circulation and large penetration, that individual piece of content actually made a difference, Pulitzer Prize or not.
But it was there to be stumbled upon, right? In ways that might not have happened in the lack of fortuitous, like stumbling upon that we just don't have it today, right?
There to wrap fish. So we don't know, basically, right? So stumbling upon was certainly a thing. I mean, I think we all had experiences in our youth around these objects where corner of the eye, we notice a story, maybe it's on the table of a barber shop or something, and we go, oh, that's something I didn't know. And it draws your attention and maybe changes how you think about something. So that serendipity was certainly a possibility. Perhaps serendipity takes different flavors now. Perhaps it doesn't exist at all because everything seems programmed, at least in a very rough sense. The fact that we were depending on the packaging decisions of a bunch of old white men was not ideal, given the basic facts about our society and the needs of our society, right? So I'm basically saying we don't want to idealize a relationship between the press and society in the 20th century, but we do know that by the end of the 20th century, there were some very serious and healthy internal and external criticisms of a lot of those practices, and especially the makeup of newsrooms. And there was at least a potential for that to improve significantly. And I think one of the reasons that I think so highly of the people who do this work now is that they are in many ways a reflection of those changes, the move toward nimbleness, the appreciation of youth, the appreciation of open minds, the appreciation of ethnic, geographic, linguistic, religious diversity, gender balance. All of those issues have made the appreciation of those things have certainly improved. Now, again, has that improved the relationship? In some ways, right? If you're like, I assume most of us, like total news nerds, this is a golden age in a lot of ways, right? The fact that I can read Haaretz and I can read Indian Express and I can read, the Guardian, as well as every publication left standing in the United States of America, is a pretty amazing thing that allows me, I think, to live very differently, in many ways better than I did in the 20th century. Now, in terms of, but that relationship, that leads me to that other point you pointed out, right? The good for me versus good for everybody, or good for society, the collective good, right? So 2.7 billion people use Facebook. We've never had anything in human history like that. Like nothing has ever reached 2.7 billion humans. The Quran has at most reached 1 billion humans. BBC has never reached more than, anywhere close to 2 billion, let alone 2.7 billion. CNN never, right? No publication ever has. That's a stunning amount, right? 7.4 billion humans, 2.7 billion of them use Facebook regularly. And you immediately have to exclude the 2 billion people in China who can't get it, So, and there are a couple of other corners of the world where Facebook is largely inaccessible. So it's really like half of the humans not in China use Facebook regularly. It's a pretty stunning thing to think about, and it's growing. It's growing at a remarkable pace. A year ago, it was about 2.2 billion, and it's 2.7 billion now. It's pretty amazing. They're not fools. They get something out of it, right? People don't sign up for Facebook accidentally, and they don't stay with Facebook because they have nothing better to do. That is, in many people's lives, a really important function, right? The Facebook is playing multiple functions in people's lives. One of them is connectivity with loved ones, connectivity with communities, connectivity with people from your hometown. You can imagine that someone who has escaped from Syria and is trying to make her way to Brussels because a cousin lives there and might be able to help her get a job and settle a life there, is going to depend on Facebook in many ways to traverse all of the barriers between Syria and Brussels. And the same for people who are traversing the distance between Nicaragua and Los Angeles. So we can't forget nor minimize the role that Facebook specifically, and Facebook's other major properties, WhatsApp and Instagram, play in the everyday lives of people here in the United States. People who serve in contingent labor positions also often do multiple jobs. They often have childcare challenges, transportation challenges, scheduling challenges, and Facebook helps them manage all of that. There's a tremendous amount of scholarship, recent scholarship on this very subject, the way that people who are working under contingent labor conditions really need their phones and some core apps on their phones, and Facebook is leading among that. We've seen scholarship on the ways that Facebook allows people who are, for instance, using for-profit education institutions to try to resist and accept and make it through under really difficult conditions. So it's not to say that those practices couldn't happen under other conditions or with other platforms, but the fact is Facebook does this real easy connection with people who share your interests. I don't think there's ever been a more efficient and effective way to find people of like mind or people of like interest. That's a remarkable statement too, and that's something we have to appreciate for all of our criticisms of Facebook. And we have to weigh that as we imagine what we might do with Facebook. Facebook's been great for me. It's been great for just about every one of those 2.7 billion, just about, because we get value out of it. I mean, everyone here can tell a story about a long lost acquaintance who found a relationship reflowering with you through this process, through Facebook. People sell used items on Facebook. People find love on Facebook. It's not the best for that, but people do. There are stories, and so it's good. In fact, in a lot of ways, it's great for many of us. But collectively, it's terrible. And this isn't a paradox. It's actually a pretty common thing. It has to do with the collective damage that something can do. So for instance, my car is great for me. I love my car. It does everything I want. It makes my life better, makes my life easier, serves me well. Our cars are a disaster, right? Collectively, our cars are bad for humanity. Individually, we can't live without them. So Facebook's a lot like that. That just makes the problem harder. I had a little bit of tiff on Twitter yesterday with an economist, Dean Baker, a pretty well-known guy. He was trying to come up with some silver bullet to take Facebook down. And in his case, he thought that, getting rid of, protection from liability, Section 230 was the silver bullet that would take down this evil beast of Facebook. And here I am, major Facebook critic, saying, wait a minute, it's not that simple. You could take out Facebook, maybe, but actually there's reason to believe that Facebook would survive that silver bullet. Other companies would not. You might lose Bumble, right? You might lose other online dating. You might lose other things that people like. You might lose Amazon Web Services. We don't know what role Section 230 plays to protect Amazon Web Services, right? There's so many things that can flow from that. So I think there's an underappreciation in a lot of ways of the scale of Facebook, the depth of Facebook's role in people's lives, the importance it plays, and the ways in which the particular regulatory structure under which Facebook operates is not just about Facebook, but has all kinds of other permutations, positive and negative. It was my way of basically saying to Dean Baker, stay in your lane. I don't write about macroeconomics. Maybe stick to the stuff you know. But that didn't go over so well.
Jack, I'm going to let you chime in here. I know you have a couple of questions you wanted to ask.
Yes. So I want to get to talking about reform efforts, not silver bullets to be sure, but reform efforts. And I guess the question I'm most interested in, first, before we get there, a preliminary question. There are several problems you mentioned, one you didn't mention, but I'll mention all three of them. Yeah. One is that we'll call the differentiation of audiences, which is that audiences are less differentiated before the digital age. Now they're more differentiated. It's easier to differentiate. The second idea is related differentiation is what you might call distraction, but that depends on what you think people should be watching. If you think everybody should constantly be watching, the latest news about the budget, they're distracted. If you think they should be attending to their children's problems and sports, they're not distracted. The second problem, which you didn't mention yet, is disinformation. And that's the question of propaganda, conspiracy theories, etc. My question is, what's the relationship between the differentiation of audiences and the disinformation problem? If in fact audiences are quite distracted or differentiated, then probably the disinformation problem isn't as great as we thought it was. Is that true?
Oh, great question. Okay, so I like to use the word disaggregated, right? So our audiences are disaggregated, and in fact, one of the problems we have thinking about the democratic function of the press function filtered through Facebook or Google is that we have Facebook and Google have, to a dangerous extent, conflated the concepts of markets and publics. Yeah, that's for a whole other subject.
That's neoliberalism, my friend. Market equals public.
Like from their point of view, because they never carried with them the myth of serving
right
public as a in a Habermasian sense.
Right.
Nobody in Silicon Valley ever read Habermas or thought that way. I mean, it's not that people who worked for the Baltimore Sun in the 1950s read Habermas, but they lived it, right? So at least there was that ability in the profession to imagine that what you were doing was performing a convening function for public deliberation, even if it actually.
So to the main chance, does it follow that disaggregated audiences produce less harm from disinformation, or is that actually have the worst of both worlds?
Does it follow?
That is, if everybody's thinking about reading the comic strips and the sports and taking care of their child care and all that, then they're actually not listening to what QAnon has to say.
Right, right.
The argument.
So I hesitate to make that strong a case. I think the difference is that there were always LaRouchians who would now be QAnon people, but LaRouchians had to do a lot of work to find each other. And once they found each other, the best they could do was a monthly mimeograph newsletter, right? So the friction in the system kept the influence of LaRouche, John Birch, other dangerous fringe elements to a minimum. I mean, Hare Krishna's, right, to the point where the damage they would do could be shown with the effect.
The costs of organization go way down. There's another element that I assume you've thought of too, which is the entertainment value of QAnon goes way up. That is to say, the thing is, it's not just about getting around complaining about communists. It's fun, it's entertaining, it's exciting, it's reality television. When you,
I would venture to say that being a QAnon enthusiast is a lot more fun than being a John Birch Society member. And probably a lot more fun than being a LaRouche, although I'm sure they had some fun. And so there is that, right? But it's also about the ability to think you're not alone, right? You could be a John Birch Society member and think you were the only one in your town who was, and be grateful when the newsletter arrived. But it was still hard to imagine that you were part of an army that might make a difference. And whether it's QAnon or any other similar fringe movement, and they exist all over the world, it's now super easy to imagine that you are part of the critical mass that can make a stand. And, remember, if you think back to why people filled Tahrir Square, why people filled the streets of Tunis, a lot of it was because they assumed everyone else would, right? That notion, I'm part of, we've hit critical mass, I won't be the only one out there.
The costs of collective action have gone way down.
Exactly.
But I want to tie this to the second point. So we talked about differentiation or disaggregation of audiences and its relationship to disinformation. But disaggregation of audiences is not the same problem as funding sources. That is, you could fund newspapers and still you'd have disaggregated audiences.
Yes, and you did, right? So let's also remember that the Pittsburgh Courier served a particular part of Pittsburgh, and the Pittsburgh Post served a particular part of Pittsburgh. And they were very different parts of Pittsburgh. The Amsterdam News served a different aggregated audience than the New York Times. Right. So, in fact, it still does. The Amsterdam News still exists. Yeah. So given that, that's not new. The newsstands we used to walk upon demonstrated the disaggregation of our reading audiences by the fact that there were hunting magazines and running magazines and African-American newspapers and newspapers in Spanish and newspapers in English and for conservatives and for liberals and the tabloids for the subway ride home, et cetera, right? So the disaggregation is not actually that new. It is the notion that you can do it at the micro level, and that you can layer upon these identities and then target content that conflates both advertisements and personal appeals. I'm sorry, not just both, but advertisements, personal appeals, what we might call news, what we might call propaganda, all of that flows into this undifferentiated column where everything is basically packaged the same. That just makes it harder for a reader to take cues and to even dive deep into it. So when we're talking about the propaganda problem, it often gets flattened out in a very 20th century sense that the problem is people are saying things that are not true. Or the problem is people are spreading dangerous information that might, cause someone to shoot someone. That's kind of the problem. The bigger problem is in the environmental effect of this. The environmental effect of so much garbage flowing by you, flowing through you, and doing so in a way where it's impossible or hard to differentiate between the garbage and the stuff that's not garbage. I don't even want to.
By the way, that's what successful propaganda does. But I want to move on to this issue. Suppose I wanted to talk to you about reform. It seems to me you could target reform at the problem of disaggregation, but since disaggregation has always existed, it seems to me that's not where you want to move your put your efforts.
Okay.
You could aim at the problem of disinformation, but if you're worried about the survival of the press, you would aim neither. You would aim at funding sources, and you would try to figure out how you would achieve viable funding sources for these institutions. Now, have you thought about these questions? You could break up, you could change, you could differentiate functions, you could change the legal basis of the advertising system. There are lots of things we could think about. You could do revenue sharing. I mean, you would probably have heard the list before.
Yeah, and I find that while certainly we agree there are no silver bullets, the sad news I have to deliver is they're not even copper BBs. These interventions are all inadequate in and of themselves. Collectively, they might make a difference. I don't think we should say that there's one problem here, and I don't think we should say there is one appropriate response to that problem. But we also, like with Section 230, have to take into account all the different externalities and permutations and unintended consequences of what we do. So let me also say that I am not optimistic that, and not confident that anybody has presented a really compelling case for any particular intervention as of now, as of September 2020, with the exception of Balkin and Zittrain, who have, I think, come up with a really cool idea that we could talk about later. But it's also an idea that I haven't fully grasped, and I would, at some point, I want to get in the same room with you when we're allowed to do that. And
well, yeah, all right. So we can talk about it. I'm interested, though, in your sense.
Yeah.
Given the fact that the economic models are going to evolve on their own, and given the fact that a democracy worked with 19th century media and it worked with 20th century media, so we got to make it work with 21st century media. The question is, where do we aim the most of our attention? Do we just try to shore up these institutions that produce information and news gathering and hope that they can connect to various audiences, or do we try to professionalize the organizations that basically are the curators of all of our discussion?
I wouldn't use or, right? I would say the following. First of all, we do have to identify the institution. Well, first let me start with what democracies need.
Yeah.
Democracies, of course, need the raw materials for adequate deliberation. They need dependable information. They need the institutions that vet that information. They need the institutions that present that information and make it accessible. All of that is currently under stress from things much deeper and older than Facebook and Google. Democracies need methods of motivation. They desperately need ways to identify like-minded people and allow them to join to express themselves collectively. That's why it's actually in the First Amendment that people can petition their government in a sense collectively, right? It's freedom to, right to assemble and then petitioning the government are all part of the same part. Now, we need that. We need the ability to motivate. We also need the ability to deliberate. Right now, our media ecosystem and every element of it is geared toward motivation and not to sustain deliberation. And my agenda is to facilitate deliberation. I think that's the forgotten side of this democratic puzzle or democratic machine that we have let either atrophy or we've actively dismantled. What that means is that we need to strengthen institutions like the reporting and editing process, and that might mean finding better ways for the commercial sides of that to do their job, find ways to lightly subsidize them. I mean, by all means, keep the postal discounts, by all means, make it easier for them to do their job, by all means, make it easier for their labor supply to arrive educated and trained. All of that is really healthy for us, but we also should experiment with public funding. We should experiment with more philanthropic supported journalistic institutions. Texas Tribune is a great example of that. ProPublica is a great example of that. We need just more experiments like that, and accept that they're going to lose money. We should not imagine that these institutions are designed to make money, and we should be okay with it performing a democratic function the way we don't expect churches and temples to make money, even though many of them do, almost by accident. Now, so we have to really get creative about how those institutions will be supported. It's a hard thing to do in the current climate, but let's put that. But that is a long-term agenda to foster deliberation. Other institutions that foster deliberations, public schools, libraries, museums, universities, all of which deserve much greater public funding. And then we might want to think about creating institutions and platforms that don't yet exist that allow this, right? Ways to recreate the Chautauqua experience or create a whole new Chautauqua experience that's easily accessible and maybe multilingual and removes barriers and embeds norms and practices and rules that allow for open deliberation where there's no domineering and domination. I mean, those should be things that our most imaginative people are focused on right now, instead of finding better ways to get people to click on ads, which seems to be what our smartest people are aiming toward. So, if we could put some of our creative energy toward figuring out what it means to deliberate, what it means to deliberate in a healthy way, what it means to deliberate with dependable information, we might be able to get to step 2 of some problems.
Because see what you're saying.
There's the problem to do with misinformation or disinformation or propaganda. The problem is we can't talk about important things like grown-ups anymore if we ever really could. But I still think we used to be better at it than we are now.
I understand your point. Scott.
Hi. Thank you so much for being here, Siva. This is really interesting. I'm going to ask you in almost an impossible question, which is how do we, I don't know, can you give me your reaction to this attitude that the problem will solve itself? Okay, yeah. Which is that, it took 250 years before people figured out how to pick books, because they didn't know who the author was, and a whole ecosystem had to develop. And how do we know that people are just going to figure it out after a while? On the one hand, and on the other hand, as you say, sometimes social media can feel like a cesspool, and the more garbage that gets thrown at us makes it less appealing. And so we start retreating, and then the social media companies engage in more content moderation because they can see that they don't want to become the next MySpace. So yeah, I'm sure you've heard this 1,000 times before, but since you're such an expert, you're a real expert, I was curious to your reaction.
All right, well, so I would bring this back to scale for one thing, to look at both Facebook and Google. So I mentioned 2.7 billion people using Facebook, never had anything like that before. It is one of the 5 wealthiest companies in the world right now. Another of the 5 is Google. Actually, I haven't checked this week. Both of them might have dropped to the second 5. It was a weird week for Silicon Valley. Given that these are incredibly, not only financially successful companies, but companies really deeply embedded in the daily habits of billions of people, we don't actually know how many people use Google on a regular basis. Google tracks searches, not humans. but YouTube traps humans, and we're talking 2 billion people use YouTube every month, and that's again an astounding number. The only non-Facebook company that comes close to YouTube, because the next three are WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, and Instagram. The only other company that comes close, it's even in that club, is WeChat. So what we might think about as solving itself, right? These companies, Facebook specifically, are certainly doing what they think they can do to clean themselves up, to address one or two or three of their fundamental maladies, the kind of things that have created bad publicity for them and perhaps alienated users. So two things about that. For all of the criticism of Facebook, for all of the bad headlines, for all of the seeming disasters that Facebook has put itself through in the past few years, Facebook usage keeps growing, Facebook revenue keeps growing, Facebook power keeps growing, dependence on Facebook keeps growing, Facebook keeps growing closer to Jair Bolsonaro, closer to Rodrigo Duterte, closer to Narendra Modi, and closer to Donald Trump, for a variety of reasons, right? They are not in any danger of being displaced from the center of power in the world. They're not in any danger, despite all that bad PR, of actually losing users in any significant number or revenue in any significant amount. So I just see no evidence that even though I would grant that they've done some pretty sincere things in the past 2 years that they should have done in the previous 5 years when people were being slaughtered in Myanmar and they didn't seem to care, to clean themselves up, it's all cosmetic. And it's cosmetic because it doesn't get to the root of the problem. The problem with Facebook is Facebook. The problem is the very design and core incentive system of Facebook, that it is attention-based, that it is about engagement, monetizing engagement. Once you monetize engagement as your prime function and you put growth as your prime goal, then everything flows from that. And that's exactly what they've done. And they've not changed that. They've not altered their goal, nor would we expect them to. It's a company with shareholders and it wants to keep its board happy. And fundamentally, they'd like to keep regulators at bay. They don't want to anger all of these presidents and prime ministers. But at the same time, basically, they work for Peter Thiel and Mark Zuckerberg. They don't really work for us. We're their cattle. We're their raw material.
Just one question. Do you take it seriously that, everyone I know hates Facebook in the sense that they don't even want to work for it. I know people who just won't work for it. There's a real techlash among people who 5 years ago would have given their right arm for it. Is this just not a threat?
Yeah, everyone I know voted for McGovern too, which actually.
But these are the people who are.
Yeah. That's part of the thing. Yeah, I get that in our university environment. I get this all the time. I get, my students will say, I'm not on Facebook until they are. And I say, oh, use Instagram? Well, of course, use Instagram hours a day. Well, then you're on Facebook. But the fact is, everybody we know, the five of us, if everybody we knew, let's say it's 100,000 people, all quit Facebook tomorrow, Facebook makes that up in India and Brazil in half a day, right? So less than that, right? So, the growth of Facebook is just astounding, and nothing has slowed it. It's becoming more important to people's lives, not less important to people's lives. It's not that it's more fun. It's not that it's a better product. It's just becoming more important. And in a lot of parts of the world, it is all that's left, either because the media systems in those parts of the world were never really allowed to flower, never really put down roots, or those roots were quickly exterminated. Like in the Philippines, which had a gestational public sphere growing from about 1989 or 88 with the Aquino Revolution right up through about 2010, they had a pretty strong homegrown media ecosystem burgeoning up and taking leaders out for corruption and doing amazing reporting. And then since 2010, even before Duterte, it's all eroded and all the money, attention, and everything has gone to Facebook. So now in the Philippines, everyone learns about the world, lives through Facebook, and it is the world to them. Same is true in Myanmar, same is true in Sri Lanka, less so in India, but it's definitely true in Pakistan. So the United States is actually an outlier, and we got off easy in this because we have a diverse media ecosystem. We can all live Facebook free rather easily and comfortably. Now, not everybody can, as I said, like contingent workers. It's really hard to live without Facebook. We could, but if we were in the Philippines, we could not. And that's what we're facing around the world. I think a lot of times when we think about Facebook, we only think about it in terms of American habits and issues. So while there is a flatlining of growth in North America is the only place in the world where there's a flatlining of Facebook growth. And North America means less and less in the world every day.
Well, that's actually fascinating and really helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
Sandy.
Well, I mean, one of the risks of being the last on this team, and let me know, with a speaker who has been as forthcoming and articulate as you, is that much that I wanted to learn from you have already graciously provided. But I must say it's left me with a pretty dark picture. Not that I didn't get that from reading your book and your articles too. So, I mean, it's not like it's news, but can we focus on the States just for a moment? Because we do present, I think, a unique and a unique society, maybe joined to some degree by Europe, or parts of Europe, to be sure. And talk about, go back to what I know you started with, Jack and all. Talk about, is there a way for us as a society to effectively deal with power? And we can focus on Facebook as far as I'm concerned. Google presents a whole different set of challenges, I agree. And I want to throw into that mix something that I'm particularly interested in, which is the use of data, the dominance that Facebook has in that field. Is that the Achilles heel?
That's a really great question. I love that you're thinking along those lines. So in the competition world, right, if you think about the dominance of Facebook and Google, one of the reasons that neither one of them has ever faced serious competition since they reached some level of maturity is their both sunken cost and inherent advantage of data. I would add infrastructure to that. I think these two things are often lost in the story, especially with Google. You know, in the early years of Google spent a whole lot of cash, venture capital money mostly, on infrastructure that would make it resilient and thus be less likely than the other search engines to crash under high demand. Zuckerberg learned from the mistakes of Friendster, for instance, and knew that he wanted to carefully calibrate the growth of his service to match the growth of the infrastructure that could support it so that people wouldn't lose interest in Facebook if it was down for 24 hours. And to my knowledge, Facebook has never been down for 24 hours, which is an amazing thing, especially when you think back to 2004 through 2007 when things went down, including Gmail all the time, right? So that the investment in infrastructure and then the accumulation of behavioral data, not all of which is valuable, but enough of it is valuable and it's refined so well that that's a first mover advantage, even if they weren't the absolute first mover, but the best mover advantage that emerging competitors find it really hard to match. So who in the world really competes? Well, WeChat, largely because WeChat has a tremendous base from the start. They have 1.5 billion users, most of whom live in the People's Republic of China. But WeChat also has a lot of services that Facebook doesn't yet offer, or at least doesn't offer in a scaled up, dependable way. People in China live through WeChat. It's the operating system of their lives. Zuckerberg dreams of being the operating system of our lives, but he's not quite there, or having Facebook serve as the operating system of our lives. So how do we respond to that, right? How do we respond to that vision? How do we respond to that potential concentration of power, which is, I think, something we have to take very seriously. And I actually think that and the fact that our whole media ecosystem does not facilitate deliberation. Those are the two greatest threats of Facebook. I consider misinformation, disinformation, propaganda to be like a third level problem, a third order problem, and not really the crucial one. I think those are important things, but that can't be where our focus is, or at least it's not where my focus is. But in terms of that data accumulation, that's really important. So one of the ways we might address the burgeoning power of Facebook, and to some degree Google, is to think about restrictions on the retention of data, that either there are certain categories of data that should not be retained for more than 30 days, or there could be an absolute deadline of a certain age of data accumulated that has to be purged completely, or put aside and never, used in any sort of targeting fashion. That's one thing that could really give later entrants into these markets something of a fairer playing field, if that's what we want more of. And I'm not sure we want more of. I would like to also see stronger data protection across the board. So, we might actually be less exploited by these firms, even the next series of firms that try to come up. But the other thing that we might think about, and I've heard some people argue this as a potential intervention on the antitrust front, instead of the more cartoonish way of saying, let's spin off the last two big acquisitions, the Oculus, or the last three Oculus and WhatsApp and Instagram, and make them their own companies. Then we just have more companies that do the same thing, and that doesn't necessarily improve life. I think one thing that makes a lot of sense to me is the possibility of spinning off the advertising function from Facebook and saying, okay, we're going to spin off the advertising function, make that an independent company that has to then create a market for advertising that would serve other content-based platforms. So, maybe Comcast becomes its client just as much as classic Facebook becomes its client. And you at least are diffusing the power that way. And maybe you're diffusing the data that way too. So that's one intervention. One, I think, really short-term basic intervention I think could help. And I've been pushing this for a while. Just in terms of political advertising. And again, not that that's a primary danger. I think it's an issue, but not a primary danger. I think it would be really helpful if the United States had a law basically saying restricting the targeting of advertisements from political campaigns to the district in which the campaign is being run, so that a senator or a governor couldn't target an ad at a group more narrow than the state itself. That would mean every person in the state would get the same message from the candidate. Right now my wife and I can get very different messages from our candidates for city council or state senate. They might be the same, they might be different. We really can't know, because all I see is what I see, all she sees is what she sees. There's very little accountability in that system. And the fact that people run thousands of versions of ads, campaigns run thousands of versions of ads, makes it that much harder for any sort of accountability of the claims in ads. Unlike in television, where if someone running for mayor or running for state senator runs a television ad, my wife and I are sitting in the living room, we're going to see the same ad. Now there are ways to target, but not micro-target, right? You can pick one ESPN commercial and one Bravo commercial and get slightly different audiences. But nonetheless, broadcast is broadcast. It's not quite this thing where you can run one ad. The same candidate can tell someone who's anti-abortion one line and pro-abortion another line, and they might not find that that they're getting different messages, right? That's a total hypothetical. I doubt anyone's has the gumption to do that. But that, things like that, the micro-targeting is just not healthy, even if it's not, as I said, a major problem that really threatens democracy. I just think it's a simple reform that would really help. But again, that's not a major one. I do think that the notion of reducing the embedded and inherent power of all of that data could be a really fruitful way to pursue interventions here. But mostly I think we just need to be more creative. I think we tend to flow with 20th century responses to a set of companies that does not resemble 20th century firms in any way or 19th century firms in any way. So every time I read about Standard Oil, I want to remind people that ExxonMobil is one of the largest companies in the world, and it's almost Standard Oil. And every time someone wants to wax poetic about the breakup of AT&T, I want to remind them about AT&T and that they just bought CNN. So there's like antitrust isn't all that, is basically what I'm saying. Not over time anyway.
Well, I have a lot more questions that you've just raised. I'm sorry this is not going to be longer, but thank you. I really appreciate it.
I mean, it's fun. And, on any of these, we can always go really deep. And I have so many questions, for the expertise in the room too. I like to be unsure about a lot of this. I like to say that that's why I get a lot more pleasure out of questioning other people's proposals than even making my own, because I'm not even convinced of my own. I think this is a really hard problem. I think we've never seen anything like Facebook and not seen anything like Google. And I mean those things both in a positive and negative way, right? We've never had the benefits of Google before. We've never had the benefits of Facebook before. And we haven't learned to cope with those in healthy ways either. Those have fed into, I think, unhealthy dependence rather than perhaps a healthier relationship that keeps them at bay, the way that we might keep the candy bars on the top shelf. We haven't quite, because we're all babies in this environment. So I don't think we've thought seriously enough about ways to either maximize or protect the benefits and minimize the harms. And right now, that first one to be vitriolic about Facebook because I would sell more books. But I think the let's kill it, let's crush it is not helpful, mostly because it's not realistic. Saying we're going to kill it or crush it starts with a premise that it's killable or crushable, and it's just not. It's just too big. The United States is just one country.
Yeah, but I'd be glad if we could figure out how to deal with the problems you articulate just in the States. And it's not heartening to know that we may have created something we really cannot ever control. So keep thinking about it, Siva, all right? And writing.
Cool. Thank you. This is fun. Good.
Siva, thank you so much for agreeing to spend the time with us. And thanks for the contributions that your books make, which I think are really important foundations that we're going to have to think through as we sort of tussle through all the different strands of this complicated, multifaceted problem. We appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Oh, my pleasure. This was fun. I hope I see you in real life very soon.
Very soon.
Thank you.
We agree.